It was a little past 10 a.m. when Derrick Langston guided his sleek black Cadillac CT6 into a roadside rest stop just off I-94, roughly 40 miles west of Lansing, Michigan. Dressed sharply in a charcoal gray blazer and a pale blue button-up shirt, Derrick looked every bit the image of a man headed to a boardroom meeting. And he was. Sitting on the leather passenger seat was a slim, zipped folio, neatly packed with documents for a policy roundtable with the governor, scheduled for noon. For over 2 decades, Derrick had served as a judge in Michigan's 22nd District Court. He had built a reputation for being reserved, measured, and unwaveringly fair, a man of the law through and through. But in that moment, none of that mattered. As he shifted into park and reached for his water bottle, a state trooper patrol car pulled up behind him, lights flashing. Inside the cruiser sat Officer Daniel Price, a young white cop who narrowed his gaze at the man in the luxury car. From his perspective, a black man sitting alone at a rest stop in a high-end vehicle raised a red flag. Without radioing for confirmation, Price called his partner, Officer Megan Holt, who was only a few minutes behind. Price didn't wait. He exited his vehicle with a rigid posture, approaching the Cadillac with purpose. Derrick noticed a movement through his mirror, rolled down his window, and made sure both his hands remained visible on the steering wheel. "Good morning, officer," he said, voice even and composed. "Is there a problem?" Price didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned Derrick up and down with the kind of stare that carried more suspicion than curiosity. "We got a report of a stolen vehicle matching this make and color," Price said coldly, his voice devoid of emotion. It was seen leaving a nearby gas station. Derrick raised his eyebrows slightly, puzzled. "I wasn't aware of any such report," he replied. "I just stopped here to rest before heading into Lansing. I can show you my registration, if you'd like." Rather than taking him up on the offer, Price stepped back and placed his hand on his holster. "Step out of the vehicle," he snapped, his tone abruptly shifting from neutral to commanding. Derrick exhaled slowly. He didn't want trouble, but he also knew how quickly things could spiral. Calmly, he opened the door, standing tall, his 6'2" frame composed and non-threatening. By the time Officer Holt arrived, the situation had already intensified. Derrick now stood behind his car with his hands raised slightly, Price hovering close. Holt watched silently, clearly unsure but not stepping in. "I'd like to know what exactly I'm being accused of," Derrick said, his voice no longer just polite but steady and firm. "I haven't broken any laws." Price ignored the question. Instead, he circled around to the front door of the Cadillac, reached inside, and began rifling through the glove compartment. Derrick instinctively took a step forward. "Officer, I do not consent to a search of my vehicle," he stated clearly. That was all Price needed to escalate. "That's obstruction," he barked. "You're interfering with an ongoing investigation." Before Derrick could respond, Price grabbed his wrist, twisted it behind his back, and slapped a cold metal cuff on. Holt hesitated, then moved in to secure the other arm, her silence a reluctant compliance. Derrick didn't resist. He didn't raise his voice. But as the cuffs clicked shut, he looked Price square in the eye. "You're making a grave mistake." A few other travelers at the rest stop had taken notice. One college student, on a road trip with friends, had already started recording with her phone. A retired Army sergeant watched from a distance, shaking his head slowly. "That man doesn't look like someone who stole a car," he muttered. Price and Holt didn't seem to notice. They were too focused on leading Derrick toward the backseat of the cruiser, like he was some dangerous felon. But even in cuffs, Derrick moved with poise. His head held high, not out of arrogance, but disbelief. Disbelief that everything he had earned, everything he had stood for, could be disregarded so easily because of how he looked. As he was seated in the back of the cruiser, Derrick stared out the window at the trees lining the lot. He didn't feel rage, not yet. What he felt was sharper than anger. It was clarity, precision, a calculation beginning to form in his mind. This wouldn't end the way they thought it would. Inside the Jackson County State Police precinct, Derrick Langston sat on a stiff, molded plastic chair, the kind designed more for control than comfort. His wrists were no longer shackled, but the red imprints in the cuffs lingered like silent reminders of what had just taken place. He hadn't been offered water. No one had explained his rights beyond a rush Miranda warning. And still, no one had let him call his office, where people were likely wondering why he hadn't arrived for the governor's noon roundtable. The booking officer barely looked up from the screen as he input Derrick's information. He treated the process like muscle memory, impersonal, mechanical, as if Derrick was just another anonymous name, another entry in a system that moved too fast to care. In this environment, calm was interpreted differently. Derrick's silence, his refusal to yell or complain, didn't earn respect. It made them suspicious. A quiet man in expensive clothes who didn't protest was, to them, a man who had something to hide. Officer Price, the one who arrested him, paced the corridor in slow loops, occasionally glancing toward the holding room with an expression halfway between irritation and uncertainty. Officer Holt, his partner, stayed more in the background. She hadn't said much since they arrived, but the tension in her jaw and the way her eyes occasionally flicked to Derrick revealed an inner discomfort. 2 full hours passed. Derrick had asked politely 3 times to call his office. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't been sarcastic or dismissive, just direct. "I have an obligation in Lansing," he had said. "If you check the governor's public calendar, you'll see my name on today's docket." Each time, they waved him off. No explanation, no acknowledgement, as if his words were just noise. Around him, the station buzzed with mundane energy. Phones rang, keyboards clacked, radios crackled with low voices. Officers moved in and out of view, some tossing casual glances at him through the glass, a few with smirks that suggested amusement. He didn't look like a man who belonged in cuffs. That was part of what made him entertaining to them. The polished shoes, the pressed suit, the composed posture. He was, to them, an oddity, probably a lawyer who thinks he's above the law. One officer muttered as he walked by. Derrick heard it, but he didn't move, didn't flinch. Eventually, Officer Price returned to the holding area and leaned against the wall, arms folded across his chest. "You going to tell us what you were doing out there?" he asked, voice mocking now. "Running the engine. Parked alone. Were you scoping out someone?" Derrick raised his eyes slowly to meet Price's. "I was checking directions on my phone," he replied evenly. "I had a meeting to attend in Lansing. That's all." Price scoffed. "Right. You people always have a story." Holt shifted slightly at that remark. She didn't speak, but something flickered across her face. Regret? Recognition? It passed too quickly to tell. Derrick didn't respond. He had seen this pattern before. In courtrooms, on witness stands. He knew the tactic. They wanted him to react, to get flustered, to give them a reason to escalate again. But he refused to play that role. He had spent years listening to young men recount similar experiences, stories that were often dismissed by the system he worked inside. He knew how quickly things could unravel once you gave them an excuse. And so he waited. The atmosphere shifted slightly when Sergeant Amanda Yates entered the precinct floor. In her early 50s, with salt and pepper hair tied back and eyes that missed little, Yates had a reputation for cutting through nonsense. She paused at the front desk, scanning the room, then made her way toward the holding area. "How long's he been sitting here?" she asked casually, but with weight behind the question. "Couple hours," someone replied. "Obstruction charge. Vehicle matched a stolen car report." Yates frowned and walked up to the glass partition. "Sir, have you been advised of your rights?" she asked directly. Derrick nodded once. "Yes, ma'am. But I've also asked several times to make a phone call. I'm a public official. I have an obligation this afternoon, and it's already been delayed unnecessarily." There was something in the way he spoke, calm, confident, unmistakably educated, that made Yates pause. She tilted her head. "What's your name?" she asked. "Derrick Langston," he said clearly. "I strongly suggest someone in this building verify that name before this becomes a larger issue." From behind her, Price scoffed. "Yeah, he's been pulling that important guy routine since we picked him up." Yates turned sharply toward him. "That's enough, officer." Then she returned her attention to Derrick. "Let me check something," she said, already moving toward a nearby terminal. Derrick didn't smile, but he knew the shift was coming. He sat back and waited. Sergeant Amanda Yates sat down in front of a workstation near the central desk, the hum of the precinct fading as her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She wasn't sure what she expected to find. Maybe a minor public official puffing up his title. Maybe nothing at all. But something in Derrick Langston's tone had landed differently. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't begged, hadn't even postured. His calm was unnerving. It wasn't submission, it was precision, authority in stillness. That kind of composure didn't come from bluff or bravado. It came from experience. She typed in Derrick Langston and hit enter. What flashed on her screen wasn't what she expected. It wasn't a minor functionary or someone inflating their credentials. It was pages of documentation, awards, credentials, judicial appointments, law degrees from prestigious institutions. Her eyes slowed as she read. Then her gaze stopped cold on a line that changed everything. Derrick R. Langston, Chief Judge, 22nd District Court of Michigan. Yates blinked. She double-checked the attached photo. The ID image showed the same face as the man now sitting silently in their holding room. Same posture, same tailored composure. She scrolled further. Academic distinctions, recognition by the state bar, oversight on statewide judicial reforms, speaker at the National Conference on Justice. Her face tightened as realization hit. The man they'd cuffed in a rest stop parking lot. The man they'd ignored for 2 hours. The man Officer Price had mocked for playing important was, in fact, one of the highest-ranking judges in the entire state. Yates stood up so quickly her chair rolled backward. Every movement she made now felt clipped and full of purpose. Her boots thudded softly on the tile floor as she headed straight back to her holding. At the doorway, Price was still leaning against the wall, arms folded, eyes smug. Holt stood beside him, trying not to meet anyone's gaze. Yates opened the door and stepped inside. Derrick looked up as she entered, the same calm gaze meeting hers, his hands now resting neatly on his lap. "You mentioned a meeting in Lansing." Yates began, voice more measured now. "Yes," Derrick replied. "At noon. I was scheduled to attend the Governor's Justice Reform Roundtable." She took a slow breath. "And you are Judge Derrick Langston?" He gave a small nod. "That's correct." There was a pause, a beat of silence before she spoke again. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "I owe you an apology. This should never have happened." Behind her, Price straightened up as if yanked upright by invisible strings. "Wait, what do you mean, Your Honor?" His voice cracked slightly. Yates turned to face him, tone flat. "You arrested a sitting state judge without verifying his identity. You searched his vehicle without a warrant. You denied him his right to a phone call. That's not just sloppy, officer. That's unlawful." Price's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His shoulders twitched like he wanted to defend himself, but the words weren't there. "He didn't act like a judge," he said finally. "Didn't say anything when you had his ID." Yates cut in. "It's your job to verify information before escalating, not after." She turned her head slightly toward Holt. "And you," she said, voice lower now. "You went along with the arrest. You cuffed him." Holt looked down. I didn't know." "That's the problem," Yates said. "You didn't ask." She turned back to Derrick. "Sir, would you like to contact your office now? Or would you prefer we have someone escort you to the Capitol?" Derrick let out a breath, not exasperated, not dramatic, just tired. "Yes," he said quietly. "I would like to make that call." Yates nodded, stepped aside, and motioned him forward. As he walked past Price and Holt, the shift in the room was visceral. The same man they had paraded into the station was now moving through it like gravity itself had changed. Other officers had begun to notice. Conversations slowed. Keyboards paused. The buzz of routine broke apart. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a colossal lapse in judgment. And now it was public. Derrick was led into a side room with a secure line. While he called his assistant, Yates was already back at her desk fielding phone calls. One from Internal Affairs, another from the governor's office. The story was unraveling fast. It wasn't just because he was a judge. It was because a video was already spreading. Outside the precinct, the The young woman who had filmed Derrick's arrest had uploaded the clip to TikTok with the caption, "This man got arrested for being black in a nice suit. WTF." The video was short, just 27 seconds, but it showed enough. Derrick being cuffed, calmly asking what he'd done wrong, Price shoving him toward the cruiser, Hope following silently. Her phone camera had caught every second. The clip had been shared over 50,000 times within the first 3 hours. By late afternoon, it was nearing 1 million views. Screenshots of Derrick's judicial bio were being spliced into the video. Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Langston, hashtag Profiling Power, and hashtag This Is America began trending on multiple platforms. Civil rights attorneys were quoted. State representatives issued statements. Even local police unions felt the heat, issuing preemptive press releases. Back inside the station, every computer monitor now had a tab open with that video. Officers watched in silence. Some looked ashamed. Some looked stunned. The smirks were gone. The mood had turned electric, but not in a celebratory way, in a reckoning way. By the time Derrick stepped outside the precinct, escorted by Sergeant Yates herself, the tone of the entire building had shifted. Every officer who had once glanced at him with suspicion now watched with uncertain eyes. Some avoided his gaze. Some looked like they wanted to speak, to apologize maybe, but said nothing. Derrick said nothing too. He didn't need to. Outside, the March air was crisp, the sky a washed-out gray that matched the surreal quiet across the station's front lot. A few reporters had already started to arrive, tipped off by an early version of the viral video. They didn't yell questions. They just raised their cameras, trying to catch a glimpse of the man at the center of a story that was about to explode. Derrick climbed into the black state vehicle sent by the governor's office. He didn't look back. Inside the car, he adjusted his cuffs, straightened his tie, and exhaled. The leather folder still in his lap felt heavier than it had that morning. At the Capitol building in Lansing, the Justice Reform Roundtable was already in session. The room, oak-paneled, high-ceilinged, solemn, held the weight of the moment. Elected officials sat in quiet conversation. Policy aides typed rapidly. Legal experts leaned in to confer. But the chair at the head of the table remained empty, the one reserved for Judge Langston. At exactly 10 a.m., the double doors opened. The entire room fell silent as Derrick entered. He walked in steady and composed, wearing the same tailored navy suit, the same calm expression he had worn through the entire ordeal. The silence wasn't out of protocol. It was out of respect. Everyone stood, not because they were required to, because they needed to. The governor, seated directly across the table, rose and extended his hand. "Judge Langston, we're honored to have you here," he said. "Thank you, Governor," Derrick replied simply. "I believe the timing speaks for itself." He took his seat, placed a leather folder on the table, and paused. Every eye in the room watched him. "Before we begin the agenda, I'd like to address the room." No one interrupted. "Yesterday, on my way to this meeting, I was stopped and detained by 2 officers of our state police. I was handcuffed and denied my rights without cause. There was no warrant, no valid suspicion, only an assumption based, I believe, not on my behavior, but on my appearance." He paused. The silence grew deeper. The video of that moment is already circulating. I didn't resist. I didn't raise my voice. And yet, I was treated as a threat, as something to be controlled rather than respected. And the truth is, this isn't new. Not to me, not to millions of others. The only difference this time was a camera and a badge with a name the system finally had to recognize. Around the table, heads nodded. One young legislator wiped her eyes quietly. Another leaned forward, as if hanging on every word. We often talk about restoring trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. But trust is not granted by slogans. It is earned through accountability. It is upheld by how we treat each other when no one is watching. And dignity, the dignity of innocent people, should never be optional. No one said a word. The governor adjusted his notes, but didn't speak. For a full minute, the room simply absorbed what had been said. The agenda for the round table changed instantly. What was scheduled as a conversation on training policies turned into a crisis session. Experts reviewed footage. Legal advisors broke down the missteps. Civil rights leaders were invited in. And then came the moment no one had expected. An emergency hearing was called for that same afternoon. The topic: misconduct charges against officers Daniel Price and Megan Holt. The governor's legal counsel made a bold proposal: appoint Judge Langston as presiding authority over preliminary hearing. There were murmurs. Would it be a conflict of interest? Langston hesitated. The last thing he wanted was to appear biased. But the governor's counsel reassured him there were no legal or ethical constraints. And more importantly, the public needed someone they could trust to lead this process with fairness and transparency. Derrick agreed. 2 hours later, the lower chamber of the Capitol was filled. Media lined the back wall. Legal staff from across the state had arrived. A few community leaders had managed to get seats. The room buzzed with the weight of something bigger than the officers on trial. This was no longer about just one man in handcuffs. It was about every time someone had been profiled and dismissed and left to suffer in silence. Price and Holt entered the room together. Gone were their smirks, their casual demeanor. Holt stared at the floor. Price's face was pale, his jaw clenched like he was forcing his courage to stay. Judge Langston sat at the center of the panel, flanked by 2 other senior judges and the state attorney. He looked over the room once before speaking. We are not here to relive personal embarrassment. We are here to determine whether conduct violated legal standards and basic human decency. Body cam footage was reviewed, time-stamped, and compared to written reports. The young woman's TikTok clip was also shown. When Holt was questioned, she admitted she had never run Langston's ID, nor checked his record in the system. She said quietly, "I should have." Her voice broke slightly. Price tried to defend his actions, citing departmental discretion and instincts in the moment, but under cross-examination, his justifications unraveled. He couldn't explain why Derrick's calmness had provoked escalation. He couldn't explain why he'd ignored 3 verbal requests to make a phone call. He couldn't explain why he never verified the credentials he had in hand. Derrick remained composed through it all, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. He asked only the questions that mattered. He made it clear this wasn't about revenge. It was about restoring a standard that had been broken too many times. After 3 hours of review, the panel deliberated briefly, then returned with unanimous decision. Officers Daniel Price and Megan Holt had violated department policy, demonstrated negligence, and acted on bias that compromised their duty. They were suspended without pay pending further investigation from the State Attorney General's office. As Judge Langston read the decision aloud, the courtroom didn't erupt. It sank into silence. Price didn't move. Holt nodded slowly, as if she had already known the truth deep inside. Outside, cameras captured them exiting the chamber. Protesters who had gathered for hours said nothing. There were no cheers, no chants, just a heavy, powerful silence, the kind that lingers when the truth finally lands where it's needed most. That evening, as twilight wrapped around the Michigan State Capitol, the governor stepped up to a podium flanked by flags. A sea of microphones captured the weight in his voice. The chamber behind him was quiet, its walls still echoing with the judgment rendered just hours before. And standing just at his right, his presence steady and poised, was Judge Derrick Langston. Today was not about revenge, the governor began. It was about responsibility. He paused, letting those words hang in the air. Judge Langston has displayed the kind of composure, dignity, and professionalism that every public servant, every citizen, deserves from those who wear the badge and hold power. But it should never have been necessary. He went on to announce sweeping initiatives. A statewide de-escalation training program would be rolled out within the year. Every officer, regardless of rank or tenure, would be required to complete a course on racial bias recognition, constitutional rights, and communication strategies. Furthermore, the governor proposed the formation of an independent civilian oversight committee, empowered to investigate complaints against any state law enforcement agency. Not just review them, investigate them with binding authority. The press hung on every word. But when one reporter asked whether Judge Langston would comment, the governor stepped back and Derrick stepped forward. He didn't carry notes. He didn't need them. "What happened to me?" he said, his voice smooth and resonant. "Happens to people every day. People without a badge, without a title, without a camera nearby. People who are left to explain the unexplainable to friends, families, and sometimes courts, if they even get that far." He looked out at the crowd of journalists, citizens, police chiefs, and government staffers. "This isn't just about me. My story is not unique. That's the problem. This is about a pattern, a reflex, a wound that never fully closes because we keep ignoring it." He didn't raise his voice. It was a restraint that made it hit harder. We talk about justice like it's a destination, but justice is a standard, a practice. It begins not in courtrooms, but in choices, especially the ones made when no one is watching. He stepped back, hands at his sides, gaze steady. The reporters tried to ask more questions, but the press conference ended there. There was nothing more to clarify. The message had landed. That night, Derrick's speech went viral, not because it was fiery or shocking, but because it was calm, controlled, devastating in its clarity. The clip of him saying, "Justice begins in choices," especially the ones made when no one is watching, made its way across news segments, podcasts, and social media platforms. By the end of the week, cities across Michigan had started internal audits. Legal aid organizations began offering free consultations to citizens who believed they'd been unlawfully detained. A network of law school clinics launched an initiative titled the Langston Project, focused on community legal education and police accountability. In classrooms, Derrick's speech was analyzed next to historical judicial decisions and civil rights rhetoric. Teachers said students listened differently, closer, as if something had shifted in the way they understood power, consequence, and presence. At home, Derrick tried to return to normal life. He continued presiding over cases. He spoke to his staff as he always had. But there was something new in the way people entered his courtroom. Attorneys stood straighter. Defendants watched him more closely. Even the court bailiff, who had known Derrick for 10 years, began greeting him with a slightly different tone. Still respectful, but deeper somehow. Waited. He never mentioned the incident on the bench, never brought it up during proceedings, never shifted his tone, or offered any special commentary. His courtroom was still neutral ground. But in that silence, something powerful had been added. Every time someone stood before Judge Langston now, they understood that justice wasn't just a concept to him. It was a lived reality, a responsibility. And they could feel in the way he carried himself, in how he listened, how he spoke, how he refused to let the system grind anyone down. Meanwhile, Officers Price and Holt remained under investigation. Their conduct review triggered more than just their own case. It opened the door to re-examining past arrests, traffic stops, and detainments handled by their unit. In at least 7 instances, inconsistencies and questionable conduct were found. A pattern had formed, and what had once been dismissed as instinct or officer discretion now faced legal scrutiny. The Internal Affairs Division brought in external investigators. County prosecutors reviewed 3 closed cases tied to those officers. One man's charges were dropped entirely. Another case involving a coerced confession was reopened. This wasn't a single incident anymore. It was a tipping point. In communities across Michigan, people began to talk about the Langston case not with outrage alone, but with hope. Something had cracked open. Something long overdue. Derrick, for his part, didn't want to be a symbol. He didn't want fame. He didn't want his face on headlines. But he also didn't turn away. When schools invited him to speak, he said yes. When legal groups asked him to consult on new training modules, he showed up. When citizens wrote him letters, some filled with pain, others with gratitude, he read every one. He didn't promise change would come fast. He didn't pretend it was easy, but he kept showing up, and that, more than anything, became his legacy. Spring came gently to Michigan that year. The trees lining the walkways near the Michigan Law Enforcement Training Academy were just beginning to bloom, soft pink and white blossoms dancing in the breeze. Flags rippled overhead as if swaying to a quieter, slower rhythm. The wide stone steps leading to the main building shone under the morning sun, spotless, ready. Judge Derrick Langston stood at the top of those steps, watching the gathering below. He had been invited here, not for a legal review, not to preside over a case, not to make headlines, but to speak, to bear witness to a shift. 52 police cadets stood in formation across the lawn, uniforms crisp, boots polished, shoulders squared. They weren't just here to graduate. They were the first class to complete Michigan's newly required curriculum, expanded training in constitutional rights, racial bias recognition, de-escalation, and community engagement. A few months ago, many of these cadets had started their journey under a very different system. Some joined the academy believing the old methods were good enough. Others came in already skeptical of the culture they might inherit. But none of them could have expected how fast everything would change. And yet, here they were, the first class of a new chapter. Langston had turned down dozens of interviews since the incident, declined invitations to speak on national broadcasts, avoided magazine features and TV spotlights. But this felt different. This was the place where change could be seeded, quietly, purposefully. As the director of the academy stepped up to the podium to introduce him, the cadets remained standing, their eyes forward. The director didn't need to elaborate. Everyone knew who Judge Langston was, what he had endured, what he had embodied. He approached the podium, adjusted the microphone slightly, and looked out over the faces in front of him. 3 months ago, I stood on the other side of the badge. He began. I was treated not as a man, not even as a citizen. I was treated as a threat, based solely on a glance and a guess. He let the words settle. That experience could have made me angry, could have made me retreat, could have made me lose faith. But instead, it made me more committed, not to punishment, but to purpose. His tone didn't waver. His voice filled the space without force. It didn't need volume. It carried weight. You're not here to enforce rules alone, he continued. You're here to uphold dignity. That starts with how you see people. Every person, not as a risk, not as a profile, but as someone's father, someone's sister, someone's friend. A few cadets shifted slightly, not from discomfort, but attention, absorption. It wasn't just a speech anymore. It was a message from someone who had lived the reality behind the words. He told them that laws were only as strong as the people trusted to apply them. That authority was only as righteous as the integrity of those who held it. That every badge came with a weight heavier than metal. He didn't speak long. He didn't need to. When he stepped away from the podium, he gave the cadets a final nod, not formal, not distant, personal, human, a gesture of belief. As the ceremony ended and families stepped forward with flowers, applause, and phones, one young black cadet broke away from his group. He walked back toward the steps and paused in front of Judge Langston. "Thank you, sir," he said simply. Langston looked at him and returned a small nod. "Go, sir, with honor." The cadet nodded once more, then turned back toward the group. As the field cleared and the ceremony dissolved into clusters of photos and quiet celebration, Derrick remained on the steps. For a moment, he wasn't thinking about the precinct, not about the cuffs, not about the silence in the holding cell. He wasn't replaying the video or remembering the headlines. He was thinking about what came next. Change, he knew, wasn't a roar. It didn't crash down in a single moment. It came slowly, through small choices, quiet corrections, one class at a time, one reform, one policy, one person choosing to speak, to notice, to do the harder thing for the right reason. For the first time in weeks, he let himself feel it. Hope, real hope, because justice wasn't just a courtroom or a decision read aloud. It was how we carried ourselves, how we treated strangers, how we responded to pressure, how we chose, over and over, to see people clearly, especially when the easy thing was to look away. As the sun dipped lower and the crowd thinned, Judge Derrick Langston turned from the academy steps and walked toward the future he was helping to shape, not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a builder of something better. He knew there would be setbacks. He knew there would be resistance. But he also knew this. The strongest power doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it speaks with clarity, stands with dignity, and waits for the world to catch up. And in the echo of his footsteps across the stone, the foundation of that world was already being laid. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel to hear more real stories that challenge, uplift, and bring truth to light. Like this video to let us know you believe in the power of dignity and justice. Share it with someone who needs to see what quiet courage really looks like. Because sometimes the most powerful stand is the one taken in silence.